Hello, everyone, and welcome to Social Emotional Development in Early Childhood. I'm your host, Dr. Turner, and this week is fascinating because it's not just cognitive development, like how do we learn to think in more sophisticated ways or solve puzzles. It's the question of how the puzzle, really, of how we interact with each other. How do we determine our own self-worth? What is our personality like? How do we make decisions based on what our cultural mores and values are? So much of this is developing in early childhood that it's worth really paying attention to this, even if you don't plan on working with young children. So one of the first things you have to know is that in early childhood, a child's business is to test the limits. You want them to be pushing themselves a little bit to try new things. At the same time, you want them to be safe. And so as a parent or a caregiver, one of your big challenges is how much of that testing do you let them do? Do you monitor without diving in and trying to fix things? And so this is one of the hard things about working with young children, is this balance between letting them experiment with the world in order to understand it and knowing when to intervene. So one of the very first tasks we have as human beings is to understand who we are in the world, how we're similar and different from others. Experts typically agree that babies don't really have a sense of themselves as individuals yet. That's something we develop that, oh my goodness, I'm somebody who is different than my sister, than my friend. I have physical characteristics that are different. I have likes and dislikes that are different. And so this emergent sense of differentness comes first. And the second thing is the development of what the me self is, that not only am I different, but other people have a different view of me than I do. So I self really is, I am different from others. Me self is more complex because it's understanding that someone else's assessment of me is different than the way I see myself. So I could see myself as being warm and friendly. Well, little Joy on the playground thinks I'm mean. And so this understanding that other people see us differently is really big. And it has a lot to do with theory of mind, that we're able to understand that other people think differently than us. Now, the sense of who we are has a lot to do with self-concept. And remember that self-concept is just how we see ourselves, and self-esteem, which is how much we value, like the value we attribute to our self-concept, whether or not we feel like we're valuable or not so valuable. And so self-concept in early childhood tends to be really optimistic. Children often use very concrete terms to talk about themselves, their attributes. I am tall, I have black curly hair, I like dolls, I am sad, I like to go to the store. And they're pretty optimistic about what they can achieve. And they don't tend to compare themselves to others so much at this age. They're more interested in who they are and what they can do and what they like and don't like. Now, self-esteem, that valuation of the self-concepts, is very much predicated on skills and attributes. Like I have pretty hair and I can, play the piano. And it's usually pretty good. Young children usually have pretty good self-esteem. They start to be vulnerable to other people's perceptions of them right before kindergarten. They start to understand that there can be negative perceptions of them. And they just start to integrate other people's opinions of who they are into their own sense of who they are. Self-concept or self-esteem isn't phased so much if they're not good at something that they don't value. So if they don't really value soccer and they're not good at it, they don't really care. So they're able to distinguish between things that matter and don't matter to them. And another really important facet is children are starting to understand cultural differences, and they are developing in ways that are consistent with the values of their particular culture. Americans are pretty individualistic, generally speaking, meaning that we really value autonomy and individualism and doing things on our own, creating something on our own. But a lot of other cultures, rather than emphasizing this, what you can do on your own, like start a business or whatever, they're more interested in connecting with others. And the sense of the individual is less important than what we do together. And that's more likely to happen in a country like Japan, in which a collectivist identity is valued more than how you blaze a trail by yourself. One of the things you should know is that children start to understand themselves as belonging to a certain race by about 4 years old, which is why it's terrific if you can be in a school or a situation in which your child is able to interact with children of other races, because by doing so, they learn to trust other children, other races. There's tends to be less fear about somebody who's different. And so integration, I see as a really powerful and positive thing. Another thing children are developing is an autobiographical personal narrative, which integrates who they think they are, what they like, what they don't like, what they look like, into an ongoing story of themselves. Like I used to like dogs, but I don't anymore because one barked at me. But they're given meaning. And I'm going to come back to this slide at the very end of this video in order to suggest that what I'd like you to do is crawl inside the head of your child this week to think about what their autobiographical personal narrative would be. Who are their friends and why? What do they like to do? What does that say about them? What is their self-concept and self-esteem? So I'll be coming back to that. Something else children are doing, which is really interesting, is developing a conscience at this part of their lives. At age 2, when they're a toddler, they basically have a sense of right and wrong, good or bad. Things are really binary. But age 3, a sense of fairness and justice, think about how much more complex that is. Who gets how much and why? What do people deserve? That begins to come into play. And so as children grow in terms of what is right and wrong socially, how we value people and ourselves, this capacity for moral reasoning is really big. And even young children have the ability to tell the difference between a social convention, which is like you shouldn't like burp in the middle of dinner, or you should chew with your mouth closed. They can tell the difference between a social convention, like I should probably not wear my swimming suit to church, and a moral imperative, which means I don't treat others with cruelty, that other people deserve certain things like food and shelter and kindness. Moral imperatives are more abstract. And so this social development, moral development, emotional development is really interesting and really ongoing, really through our lifespan. Another thing young children are starting to feel is the difference between sympathy and empathy. And if you don't know the difference, sympathy is you see something unfortunate happen to somebody else, like they have an accident and hurt their arm, and you feel sorry for them. You're like, that's too bad. I wish that wouldn't have happened to them. Now, sympathy is a lovely emotion. A more powerful emotion is empathy, which means that you not only maybe see the misfortune of somebody else, but you can actually put yourself in their place. You can feel how that would feel. And that's a very sophisticated emotional response that connects us to other people and helps children connect to each other. Now, Erickson would put young childhood in his initiative versus guilt stage. And he would say that initiative and autonomy, that is making your own decisions and seeing what the consequences of those decisions are, he would say that's really important for young children to engage in. And that guilt is important insofar that it helps us learn like what isn't acceptable. So as children make their own decisions, see what the consequences of their decisions are. Well, was it right to take the ball away from little Joy because you made him cry? That the more that children are able to resolve this stage, he believed that their self-image could become more positive, that they would have more emotional control because they would understand the impact of their emotions on other people, that they will be actually develop new social skills that would invite positive peer interactions. So there's this idea of personality that I want to introduce here, which I believe continually develops. When we think about personality, a lot of times we think that this is something that we have very early on and it's set in stone and it becomes part of just what follows us through our whole life. So if we're kind of quiet and shy, that we remain quiet and shy throughout our whole lives because that is part of our core personality or who we are. And yet, a lot of psychological experts would disagree on the development and role of personality, that you might be shy in one situation, but you might not be shy in another one. And so context becomes important. And so one of the things I'd like you to be a little skeptical of as we think about this idea of personality is the idea, is it rigid? Is it fixed? Or is it something that is malleable? And is it something you can really measure on a personality test? Notice that there's no end to little personality tests that you can take and metaphors that you can be like. Anybody who's ever been on a dating site can see that very often people want to shuffle you off in different directions based on this thing called personality. But is personality destiny? Is it fixed? Well, that's actually a pretty big question. And I'd like you to be pretty skeptical of those models for now. So something that is related to this development of personality and moral behavior is an early study in the early 20th century by Hartshorne and May. And they looked at lots and lots of children in order to see if they were honest or not. Now think about that. Sometimes we think about honesty as being a personality trait, right? At the same time, I'm thinking that most of you listening to this podcast right now probably think of yourself as a generally honest person. We like to think of ourselves in honest terms. And yet, if you think about it, have you ever cheated on a test? Have you ever, like when somebody said, do I look fat in these pants? And they do, and you say no. Like, notice that even if we see ourselves as honest people, that's part of our personality. Notice that sometimes we don't behave in certain ways. And so what Hartshorne and May found, after studying thousands of children in different contexts, was the context really mattered. That it wasn't just personality that drove behavior. Was the child withdrawn or outgoing or those things we usually say? But the pressure of the situation mattered. That a child who did not cheat in one class would cheat in a different class because the stakes were different, because the pressures were different. And so this idea of personality as being fixed actually is challenged by the fact that people behave differently in different contexts. And one of the great psychologists who studied the role of personality in our behaviors is Walter Mischel. And his research, I'm here to tell you, gets misrepresented all of the time. And so I want to clarify some things. First of all, he is the instigator of the famous marshmallow test, in which children were given one marshmallow and told that if they can wait for a little while, without eating that marshmallow, then they could have 2 marshmallows. And with that, the researcher would leave the room and see if the poor child would give in and eat the marshmallow or not. Well, Walter Mischel found that some children were good at it, some children were less good at it, but that with enough coaching, they were able to become good at it. Well, what happened in time was somebody did a correlational study that showed that the little children in the marshmallow test experiment who did better at resisting the marshmallow did better in high school. They had better completion rates. Their SATs were higher and they were more likely to finish college. And so they turned this correlation into the seeming cause and effect, where if a child had self-regulation at an early age, they had all of these benefits available to them and great advantages as adolescents and adults. Well, the problem with that is that it really misinterpreted what Mischel was trying to do, which was to see personality as flexible and self-regulation as teachable. And so the way he conceived of it was this, that you have your general personality, that your general dispositions you take with you into the world, your sense of adventure, your extroversion or introversion, your intuition, all of those things, your general qualities. And you also had a situation that you were dealing with. Maybe you're in a class that was hard for you, like say a math class that you're not sure you're ready for and you don't understand very much. And so these 2 things, your personality and the situation, are mediated by your mind. And this is huge. And this is what the media missed in Walter Mischel's research. That between our personalities and the situations we are in are our mind, which interprets that situation as being hostile or not, as being doable or not. It's filtered through our beliefs about what we can do or can't do. Well, I'm not very good at writing, or I'm not very good at math, or I'm not very good at hitting a ball. And so the mind influences everything. It asks, what if I miss kicking this ball in kickball? Will I be ostracized? Will I be laughed at? And so the mind, and a lot of times the mind can sabotage actions in a particular situation because you can see it as a threat. But depending on how you interpret a situation or event, you're going to respond differently. And so it's not just our personality that drives behaviors, it's the pressures. For instance, you're probably more likely to cheat in a class in which you're going to be ridiculed if you don't pass the test, if the pressures are super high, if you're afraid of being punished. That drives behaviors, according to Mischel, more strongly than just whether or not your personality is honest or not. So the role of the mind is huge here. And so what Mischel took away is you reteach this middle part. You teach kids to reinterpret that. Like, what is this a threatening situation? Is it not? Is it really hard to wait for the marshmallow? And so what he really found that did not get picked up with all of the hype about students resisting marshmallows and becoming like super successful is that how you see a situation is a better predictor of behavior than traits such as willpower. Like if you see yourself as not going to be successful in that, if you don't trust that person's going to bring you 2 marshmallows anyway. But 2 of the great things he said that I love is maybe we're not thinking right about who we are and what we can be. And too much emphasis to him was put on our personalities and not the context for development and how we interpret them. And so the takeaways from Mischel's research for you is that trust matters. One of the things that was found in a subsequent study was that children in a reliable environment at home in which translation, they could trust people to fulfill their needs, were able to wait 4 times as long for the marshmallow to materialize. Were children who were used to unstable environments, like I don't know, are we going to eat tonight at the same time, different time? I don't know. Are we just going to argue tonight? We're more likely to eat the marshmallow. He also noticed that children could be coached very easily into being able to self-regulate. That he could make if-then plans with, he could strategize with a child. He could have students imaginatively make believe that the marshmallow wasn't there or that it didn't taste good. But what he noticed was children behave differently in that marshmallow study, radically differently, actually, based on how they interpreted it. And their interpretation could be changed through direct instruction, through interaction with the child. And so this emphasis on personality, you succeed or you don't, is really kind of a false thing. And so it makes our role as people who work with children even more important. So we can help them reevaluate or reinterpret a situation in which we feel hurt. Like, you got hit in the face with a ball during kickball. Do you think he did that on purpose? I might be able to talk you out of the feeling that Johnny smacked you in the face at dodgeball because he meant to or because he didn't. And that has to do very much with the importance of determining intention for children. Now, if they're good at determining intention, they're better at emotional self-regulation because they don't interpret everything as hostile. So, here's just basically this 1 through 6 is basically shows you what happens in a child who is able to reflect about intention. That a social event will happen, say, like I said, Johnny throws the ball during dodgeball and smacks you in the face. Now, the second thing that happens is very quickly is the encoding of social cues. Like, what was the look on his face? Was he aiming for me? How do I know? And the interpretation of those cues and the generation of possible responses. Do I go over there and smack him? Do I cry? Do I tell the teacher? And then very quickly, the next thing that occurs is, well, what will happen based on what I decide to do? Will people call me a ball baby? Will, he just get meaner? And then there's an enactment of response. But the better able a child is to think through these, the more likely they were to make better choices about how to respond, because they could tell whether or not this poor girl who clearly did not want to smack the little boy in the face, they're better able to interpret cruel intentions from not having cruel intentions at all. And so self-regulation, this ability to say, but the first thing I want to do is throw that ball back at you and smack you in the face. Self-regulation develops as students, first of all, watch those around them respond in stressful situations. So the first thing is watching parents. How well do parents react under stress? Do they immediately react under pressure? Do they yell at each other? And then when the child behaves out of, quickly and without thinking about it, parents can intervene to say, well, are you sure that wasn't an accident? And so self-regulation is partly a product of how well parents are able to model and discuss behavior, and it's partly the child's own internalization of those things, which is they observe how other people behave, and then they start using things as they get more strategic. They start to use self-talk. They start to use reflection. They start to wait a minute before they respond. And those are very sophisticated behaviors. And some children will need more coaching with that than others, based on what's going on at home, based on maybe even their temperament, if they're quick to anger. But it's really worth talking about intention and the ability to slow down before you behave. I'm going to back up to this slide. So there really is, when we talk about intentionality, we have to talk about aggression, because some children really, really are mean, and that needs to be recognized, so that caregivers can intervene, and so that you can have chats with children about what is and what isn't acceptable. Now, your book identifies 3 kinds of aggression, like hostile aggression, which is I am intentionally trying to cause you harm, which is, I think and hope, less common than instrumental aggression. Instrumental aggression is we're both going for that same soccer ball, and so we ended up in a scuffle because I accidentally kicked you. But really, we were just after the same goal. And then there's relational aggression, which is I'm actually trying to sabotage your ability to have friends or connect with other people. I'm trying to really wreck your social life. And you see this happen a lot, at least I did, teaching middle school, where you'd have 3 or 4 girls, and for some reason, they would want one girl to feel bad, and they would let her know that she was being left out of a party or a gathering or whatever. So relational is maliciously intervening in somebody's social connections, and hostile is for whatever reason intentionally trying to hurt another person. So this picture is probably, if you answer my question, probably hostile aggression, because it looks as if that child is deliberately trying to harm the other one. But the big takeaway is, as a teacher or caregiver, you always respond to aggression, always, because by letting it go, you let somebody hurt, and you let that bully or that child who's being aggressive, you send the message that that's okay. So there's ways to deal with it. Your book mentions positive behavior support plans, which basically you try to look at the setting, like at what environment does the behavior occur, what usually happens beforehand to precipitate it. You intervene with the teaching moment, and you talk about consequences or give consequences. But a simpler version of that really is inductive discipline, which is where you correct a behavior and then you explain why. So rather than just swatting the kids and saying, don't do that, because notice that's modeling aggression, that you say, this is why I've given you a timeout. This is why you needed to come in from recess. This is why I'm going to ask you to go to your room for a little bit, because we take other people's discomfort into a consideration. We treat other people the way that we would like to be treated. So inductive discipline is both of those things, that you correct the behavior and you also explain why you are. Like, you're going back to the store now, I'm taking that candy bar back because you don't take things that belong to you. That's powerful. And it leverages guilt enough that it's like, yeah, you can feel guilty for things, that's okay, but that you can also make things right. Now, I'm going to provide a link to this, but one of the big social jobs that we have to do as very young people and as adults is understand other people's intentions. And so I'm going to put Rebecca Sachs' theory of mind and how it develops on this week's module for you, in case you're interested in her research and in terms of her observations of that happening with young children. Now, the last part of this video, I really want to talk about social emotional development in early childhood, gender and play, because this is going to become more and more important as children go earlier, as children grow older, I mean to say. So something we have to get straight right off the bat is that sex and gender are not the same thing, and people use them interchangeably all the time. So what you have to remember is sex is really just the parts that make you male or female. What parts do you have? Straight up biology. More complex is gender, which is social and psychological. So that's why you can have children who are like hermaphrodite children who have maybe both parts, both sexual organs, whose parents are trying to decide which sex they are, and then children who have sexual organs for one sex and yet feel a different gender in their bones. And that's when we end up having people who decide to eventually transition because they feel like their sex and their gender don't add up. So one of the things that's we're thinking about with the sex and gender question for you is think a little bit about when you began to identify as a boy or a girl. That happens pretty early, right? And how did you know in your soul that you were, I kind of feel like I always knew I was a girl. It was easy for me, right? And did your play, here's another question for you, did your play mimic that particular gender stereotype? Worth thinking about. So the emergence of gender identity is debated. Some people like to say that that gender identity, the difference between behaviors in boys and girls are socialized. That means that boys see more boys in action movies, and so they play with more rough and tumble sort of shoot 'em up play, where girls see more nurturing roles such as mothers. And so it's all culture that determines how girls and boys behave differently. But other theorists are not so sure. They're like, well, what about the role of evolution and in terms of adaptive functions, in terms of hunter-gatherer societies? What about the role of hormones? Like, we actually do have some physiological differences. And so this, whether you know it or not, is a pretty raging debate about what causes gender differences, whether those are biological or whether they're driven by culture. People get pretty aggressive, actually, about this debate. But something that's worth knowing in terms of gender scheme theory is that children who are gender aschematic, like this boy here, that means he's like, I am Tony. When he thinks about himself, he thinks of himself as Tony. Children who are gender schematic, on the other hand, think of themselves in terms of their gender. I am a boy. Now, there's usually some overlap there, but if a child is very gender schematic, I am a boy, he's going to be less willing to break out of gender stereotypes. He's going to be more likely to play games that are boy-oriented, and he's more likely to feel threatened if anybody says, like, you throw like a girl, all those kinds of horrible stereotypy things that people say, children say to each other often. Now, the people who side with the culture is the reason why we have gender roles the way we are will point to the media, they'll point to stereotypes, they'll point to gender-specific toys, clothes, activities, bedrooms, all of that. And they may even point to the fact that our earliest childhood characters are very often not just sexualized, but in terms of gender, but like hugely so. Like, we have uber, like super duper masculine men and super duper feminized females. And so some people find that troubling for little children, that their games are so hyper masculinized or hyper feminized. And so one of the other videos that I'm going to put into place for you today is children who seem to break all of those gender mores, if you will. What happens when you have a child, say a little boy, like this one, who really loves dressing up in girls' costumes? At what point do you need to worry about that? At what point do you tell him to stop, or don't you? So those are real questions. Is the child just redefining the stereotype? Is he just gender aschematic? And how do you support a child who doesn't fall into the usual norms? Now, the last thing I want to transition to in terms of socializing is friendships, because we always need friendships, I think, in our lives. And so the earlier ones sort of provide a template for later friendships. And what you see in friendships with early children in early childhood are that children often create alliances based on similar likes and dislikes. And you'll very often hear conversations like, do you like broccoli? No, I don't like broccoli. I don't either. And you'll totally watch children just agree with each other. Oh, do you like dogs? Oh yeah, I do too. And you can even if you know the children, you can tell they're lying sometimes, because you can tell that if you have the child, that child doesn't like dogs, that child is scared of dogs. And yet as they go through this friend making business, they're intuitive enough to know that one of the ways we create alliances in this world is through similarities. And so you listen to them actually sort of ape each other's answers. I don't think it means that your child is a liar. It means that they are socially intuiting that the ways that you make friends is finding commonalities. The other thing that worth keeping in mind, that cultural norms and values always shape peer relationships. And so you'll sometimes see in a collectivist culture that kids will abandon a game if a fight breaks out, or in an individualist culture that children will they don't mind being like, fine, I don't care if we disagree. I don't care if the fight breaks us up, because it's all about winning. And then there's of course a lot of different behaviors and attitudes in between those two ends of that continuum. But we'll talk about later how those emphasis on individuality or collectivism sometimes strains friendships, and whether or not that's more likely for boys or girls to do. Hint, girls are more likely to sacrifice the game. So there's a couple of dimensions of play. The first is cognitive, that from playing like alone, play becomes more goal-oriented, like we're going to build these blocks into a castle, and then these forces are going to fight these forces. It becomes more narrative. And pretend play often involves taking different roles, and children are more likely to take on roles of superheroes. The social dimensions of play, and you may notice these as you work through your child observations in this class. There's the unoccupied kid, which is not playing but observing. Not casually observing. There's the onlooker who's observing. There's a solitary, which is you're playing, like two kids can be playing together in the same room but not actually interacting. There's parallel, where they're playing beside but not with each other. So you can look at the slide on your own to kind of gauge when you're seeing children playing together. Is it from the unoccupied, disengaged child to the cooperative group play, wherein you are actually strategizing together and you need each other and you're playing very specific roles, such as when kids play school. I am the teacher now, you are the student now, we are going to follow this particular narrative path. And if children play alone, it does not necessarily mean that they're socially incapable or immature. It may just be that they enjoy playing alone. So you want to look for is patterns. And in general, now keep in mind that this gender stuff is really in general, but in general, for children ages 2 through 6, the boys are typically more physically active. They rough and tumble. They're more likely to push the boundaries physically away from caregivers, and they're more likely to impersonate characters than girls are, as a general rule. And girls tend to have fewer close friends. They tend to, they're more likely than boys to have imaginary friends, and they're more likely to play games like house and school that are less rough and tumble and more sort of intellectual. Finally, we've got parenting, and I'm not going to go into lots of the parenting because as a caregiver or a teacher, you have less to say about this, but the big takeaway about parent-child relationships is that for really, really tiny people like infants and toddlers, they just need a secure attachment. They need to know that if they cry, somebody's going to hear them most of the time, is going to respond to their needs. As they grow older, they need some warmth. They need some responsiveness. And parents need to strike a balance between being really super high in control and too permissive. Which, by the way, those of you who are parents know that that sounds really nice and tight and tidy, but is really, really difficult to implement like on the ground in the real world. So the last slide I want to leave you with is that children in early childhood often suffer from abuse and neglect, and it typically goes unreported, and you, my friends, need to be aware of that. The two most common things for children to experience are extreme neglect. That means they're left alone a lot with no one else there, and exposure to family violence. So they may not be getting physically hit or hurt or yelled at, but they're hearing other people physically hurt or yell at each other, and that is very damaging. Sometimes people think that doesn't count because I haven't touched the child, but emotionally it is very damaging to young children. And girls are more likely than boys to be abused, and abuse sort of runs a continuum in the United States between African American children experiencing the highest rates and Asian children experiencing the least. But the most important thing is not to categorize who suffers the most, but to be really, really aware of signs that may include being withdrawn or sullen, or, of course, any physical bruising or unexplained physical characteristics. So I'm going to leave you with this slide that kind of introduces what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to adopt the persona of your child this week imaginatively. And remember that this autobiographical personal narrative starts about 3 years old, but you can make your child any age. In fact, you can put them right up there at the cusp of kindergarten or first grade, 5 or 6. So that you can actually have them think about who they are, what's their self-concept, how would they describe themselves using the information from this video and the chapter. What do you think your child would say? What would they say about their friendships? What would they say about fairness? That's what I'd like you to think about this week. Now, since I like you to integrate the terms so that I know that you're understanding this stuff as I go through it, please put what that child is doing in parentheses. So if your child says, sometimes I get mad and I want to throw a ball or something, but I wait until I calm down, in parentheses, I would like you to put emotional self-regulation. Now, the child wouldn't know that term, but you do. So parentheses this week, are designed to help me know that you can label what that child is saying. So you're going to write a short narrative based on your child's point of view. What do they love? What do they not love? Who are their friends? Why are we not? What is their self-concept? What is their sense of justice? And label those things with your adult brain in parentheses. And I look forward so much, really, to your post this week.